All right, guys. Today we got two special guests, man, truly legends of the underground scene that helped build it to what it is today. Eastern Conference Records in the house, DJ Mighty My and Mr. Eon, aka the High and Mighty. Woo!
In the mix. What's up, yo?
How you guys doing today?
Good, man.
Reporting live from two very different cities, Las Vegas and Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you guys are like only like I think the second interview I've done with two people. I've only done like one-on-one interviews. So it's like, This is interesting, you know?
All right, cool.
But this is real special for me, man, to be able to cover your guys' story. You know, I like to start at the beginning and just to get you both to say a little bit about what part of Philly you're from and what your guys' childhood was like.
I grew up in Center City, Philadelphia, at this apartment complex that's on the Parkway, if you know, like Rocky, you know, when he's running up the stairs. Like I lived kind of near there in this cool like 4-building development thing that was in the city. And it was dope. And went to the same school. We went to this Quaker school called Friend Select. So it was a friend school. And that was in Center City as well. And, you know, I think we were like kind of, you know, middle class, you know, Jewish. Both of our families are from kind of New York. And, you know, we kind of just were part of the times of what we grew up in. You know, I always say, how old were you? Like, what year was it when you were 16? And for us, it was 88. And it's like to be 16 in 1988, that's kind of like when you're absorbing everything. And, you know, we just absorbed, you know, those years in terms of culture and, you know, stuff like that. And kind of that's, you know, where the basis for why to like even be into hip hop or, you know, try to, you know, do hip hop.
And both of your parents were hippies, right?
Pretty much. I mean, yeah, pretty much. Yeah. My mom had a huge afro into the 90s. And then my dad was, they were just, you know, like products of, and they were hippies. So they, you know, like my dad was 18 in 1968. So no, he was 28 in 1968, but still he was wild. And so, you know, he was 18 in 58 buying the classic jazz albums in the record stores. And I was in the record stores in 88 buying the classic hip hop stuff. So, you know, just, you know, that's where so I definitely had hippie parents.
And this actually kind of worked to your benefit because they weren't traditional parents in the way that they wanted you to be like a lawyer or things that, you know, a lot of people, Jewish people would expect, right? In a stereotypical way.
Yeah, they weren't too pushy, that's for sure. Like they were more, you know, very liberal and being like, hey, you know, do you want to go to Hebrew school? And like you would ask any kid, they'd be like, no. But, you know, usually the parents are like, no, you're going. And I think they grew up, especially like they both grew up under hardcore, like first generation, you know, New York Jews. And like they were just speaking Yiddish. And so I think like they had bar mitzvahs that were, you know, in a room full of like 15 people. And by the 80s, the bar mitzvahs kind of turn into, you know, what they are like now. And I don't know when it turned into that, but, you know, these huge parties and everything. And I remember my parents being like, no, we don't like what it's turned into. But I think it also had to do with they probably didn't really want to take me to Hebrew school either. So I think it went both ways, but they weren't very traditional and they were cool, especially, you know, coming out of college and, you know, just kind of doing what I wanted to do and not, you know, forcing anything on me. But yeah, for sure.
Got you. What about you, Milo?
Oh, we pretty much had like similar parental stories as far as kind of um, growing up in New York. Then they go to the Midwest to go to schools. Eon's dad went to Michigan. My dad went to Wisconsin. So it was a kind of a similar style of parenting. The only difference is my mom moved to New York with my sister when I was in 5th grade. And so I spent half my time in New York. So that's really the only difference. But like just going to New York every other weekend is really kind of what shaped my love for hip hop and recording the radio shows, Red Alert, bringing them back to Philly on the Amtrak and listening to hip hop on that Amtrak ride. I called it the Divorce Express because my mom lived in New York and my dad lived in Philly. So, yeah. And I had a mom who especially didn't push traditional kind of money making values. You know, she always said art over money, you know, so at a very young age, I was taught that you shouldn't aspire just for financial success.
That's amazing. And Milo, you grew where you grew up was like downtown, right? So it was like a mixture of all social economic classes. Like there was middle class, but then like you had like part of the ghetto there too. So you got to see it all.
Well, yeah, that's kind of how Center City, Philadelphia was and still is to a certain extent. But like there'd be like one middle class block, and then the next block over is like the projects, or definitely the next economic class down or up, you know. So you're really intertwined, and you see all types of different social classes and people when you grow up in that kind of environment. And then my dad was a sociologist at Temple University in North Philly. So that's a campus that's in a very kind of lower class neighborhood, lower income neighborhood. So I spent a lot of time, you know, with him on the campus growing up and getting to see that, you know, that side also.
How do you think you guys were influenced or affected by growing up in Philly under those circumstances?
I think it allowed us to kind of be able to like explore and, like, being into the different cultural stuff we were into, of like sports and gear and starter jackets and sneaks and, all that different stuff, like the cultural part. But then also, you're a teenager, and that's like the highest, when you're most kind of, absorbing everything. So I think it affect, being that we did have those parents who were, allowing us to, look at everything, so I think that was, and just this, part of it also, just kind of the Quaker education that we had like 50 kids in our class, and it was like, like 3 black kids, 3 Asian kids, like 2 Indian kids, like, you know, Jews and everything. It was like all together. And so it was like that shaped it also, all those things, like the time and just everything that was going on around us, I think.
So very diverse, and you guys were growing up amongst so many different types of people and really like learning and pulling from everybody.
Yep, definitely in the household and outside of the household. Like when you grow up and your parents are teachers, you definitely, and especially that time, like late 70s, early 80s in Philadelphia was like a very like conscious kind of liberal movement where people were kind of free with things and even sexual things. It was like a lot of like, I'm sure all over the country, but especially in this little bubble we lived in, we had very eclectic kids in our classes. Parents were just very eclectic and out there and gay and straight and just like, so we were exposed to a lot of stuff early, but like good things, like not like hardcore, like cocaine and all that stuff, but just more like cultural awareness.
Well, and it was an interesting time for you guys to be growing up in because it's like right off of the civil rights movement too, though, right?
Yeah, now you see it, like only in the last like 8 to 10 years, I'm 53. Milo's like 53, I guess now too, right? And we exactly like when you're in first grade and it was 1976. And this is like 8 years after the Civil Rights Act, right? And you're in this. It was like Friend Select was like a place where it was like, here, we're gonna make it like this is what utopia is, and like we're gonna we had this education where everything was like a committee and nonviolent, and again, like everyone was different in our class, and so it was like we were served up, and at the time, right into it. And now that things are the way they are, and you really see that you were kind of coming off the wave of the civil rights movement, and everything, and including our involvement in hip hop, and like the mid late 80s also comes from that too.
And for you, Milo, with your dad being a sociology professor, right?
Yeah.
That brought more consciousness into the household as well.
Yeah. And my dad was also like best friends with this very historic jazz musician. And my dad ended up writing a book and doing a documentary about this bass player named Milt Hinton. So that was also always in my childhood, and going to see these jazz classics and hanging out with guys like that and Dizzy Gillespie. And so like my dad was also introducing me to like a very pure form of black music early in my, I always say my dad has way more street cred than I do.
It's an interesting thing, right? Because people say that children are so innocent. They don't know about racism. They're taught racism, right? And from a young age, when you're fostering this environment for them, kids don't care about what color the other kid is. They just want to play with the other kids, So for you guys to be growing up in this diverse environment, this population and everything, it was very influential for you guys to appreciate so many different cultures and be, I guess, like have a bigger worldly view.
We also had 4 parents who were into that part of Judaism in that era of standing up for people who were being oppressed. You know what I mean? So we definitely grew up in households where that was known. You stick up for African Americans and people who are being picked on. And that's how I grew up thinking that all Jews were.
And that was an interesting thing, because at that time, at one time when Jewish people came to America, it wasn't like you guys were considered white necessarily right off the bat. Like, you guys faced a lot of racism, prejudice as well, right?
Yeah.
So like at that time that you guys were growing up, did you guys face, that kind of discrimination?
No, actually, like I mentioned it before, we were living in this bubble. And even though it was right in the middle of Philadelphia and crime happening and all this shit, we lived in this little kind of like middle class bubble where we went to this school that Eric's talking about, and it was diversified and you learned the right things. And I honestly like didn't experience anti-Semitism probably into my 20s.
Wow.
I had one incident where I was in Rittenhouse Square, which is like the most shishi neighborhood in Philadelphia. And, this is like 88 or so. And I had a Public Enemy t-shirt, and like skinheads came up to me and ripped and were like, they say black is back, all in, we're going to win. And I was like, like, I didn't know what the fuck was happening. And they like kind of attacked me and like ripped it off me. And like, I remember like being like, what the fuck just happened? And it was like, so ironically, like it, that was like a violent thing that happened to me, like basically the only thing.
But I don't remember them ever like bringing up Judaism. I remember in that situation, they were like more angry that we were white kids.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was more some white
right?
nationalist shit. Yeah,
right.
Probably. Yeah, at that point, we didn't know the difference.